here. I want to start with just a handful of observations. First, a sincere thank you to Todd McDormand and all of the faculty here in the Department of Rhetoric for this wonderful invitation to be here. It's especially profound in this day and age to be thinking about the legacy of Professor Brigance and the need for sincere engagement with rhetoric, democracy, and public advocacy. And so it's my honor to step into that legacy this evening. And I also want to acknowledge the loss of a beloved member of your community and say that I hope that we're able to celebrate her memory to the extent that's possible through the conversation this evening. I was super impressed just a little bit ago at the senior dinner where I got an opportunity to see just how rhetoric and advocacy is enacted here at Wabash College, and so congratulations to the seniors who are graduating and to the faculty who have cultivated such rich relationships with them. So with that, it's really an honor to be invited here and to share with you what is a big work in progress. So I'm in the middle of what will be a book project about memorialization in Germany, and as Dr. McDormand pointed out, most of my work has been focused on nationalism, but primarily in the United States. I have now forgotten how I found out about this memorial in Munich, but it captured my interest for a range of reasons, and my focus tonight will be primarily on the memorial itself and how it figures into the landscape in Olympiapark in Munich. So to get there, we need to have some context for what's happening not only in 2017 when the memorial opens, but what happened in 1972, which brought the reason for the memorial in the first place, and then what happened even before that in 1936, which made 1972 so rich with memory itself in the first place. The 1972 Summer Games in Munich were hailed as the so-called joyful games or happy games. They were designed to be a triumph of Western democratic culture in then West Germany and a way of erasing the memory of the legacy of the Nazi Olympics in 1936, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But there are a number of compelling storylines that gave us reason to think that the 72 games would be memorable for all the right reasons. Ulrike Maybach was a German native who at 16 years old won the gold medal in the Olympic high jump and became an early heroine of the games. Olga Korbut from the USSR was magnificent in gymnastics, winning 3 gold medals, and of course gymnastics champions are historically referred to as a so-called darling of the games, and she earned that label. And of course, from an American standpoint, Mark Spitz was dominant in 1972, where he set 7 world records and won 7 Olympic gold medals, all in a single Olympic Games. We also had a little bit of controversy. You may have heard of the US-USSR Basketball game in 1972, where the Americans thought they had won the gold medal with a 50-49 victory, only to have officials rule that there was one more opportunity for the Soviets to play, and they in fact scored and won the game. Unfortunately, that was not the most negative memory of the games, and in fact the legacy of Munich in 1972 is characterized not by tremendous athletic achievement or even by Cold War controversy, but instead by tragedy of an unprecedented proportion at the time. The terrorist attack in Munich became a pivot point in Olympic history, writes Jules Boykoff, a former soccer player himself who has become a scholar on the Olympics. And what we have seen in the years since is that this becomes kind of a touch point for understanding international terrorism and the role of sports in international conflicts. The rich irony and the painful irony is that 1972 was in fact designed explicitly by German officials to try to compensate and overcome the legacy of the painful 1936 Olympics in Berlin, and the fact that 11 Israeli athletes and coaches were ultimately murdered on German soil in Munich became an especially difficult problem to reconcile. So what I want to examine here is the role of trying to come to terms with that kind of past in a nation that already is embedded with discussions about how to come to terms with the past, and how the memorial opening in 2017 might give us some promise of being able to do that. So we'll come back to this design. This is a photograph taken shortly after the memorial opened on September 6th, and we'll come back and think about some more of the details there. But in order to get there, we need to think through some of the contextual factors that give the memorial its symbolic significance. So we'll need to identify a little bit about the nature of the Olympics itself, politics in the Olympics, the role of public memory in Germany, and public memory as it articulates with sports. And then we can talk a little bit in detail about the memorial itself and the degree to which it's possible that it can function as a site of reconciliation and healing. The modern Olympics, of course, debuted in 1896. They were the product of thinking of Frenchman Pierre de Coubertin, who was influenced by a number of different factors, including a visit to the United States, including his visit to the 1889 Paris Universal Exposition, as well as a lot of readings about ancient Greek competition and something called muscular Christianity, which was affecting Britain and the US in particular in the mid to late 19th century, where we kind of combined an ethos of physical, manly competition and godly pursuit. And that's something that continues to influence our perspectives about athletics today. Although the idea of the original or the modern Olympics was premised on a notion of amateurism, the ancient athletics in Greece, the ancient Olympics, were not necessarily amateur pursuits. They did compete for prizes. They didn't just compete for the love of the game, but that is a popular mythology, and that supported a popular mythology in the late 19th century about amateurism more broadly. So almost all of the modern sports that we know of in the United States emerged in that time period, and they were mostly built on the foundation of amateurism, which was primarily designed to allow elite, property-owning white men, Christian men, to be able to have an enclave of athletic competition and to keep out Catholics, non-whites, non-males, etc. And so there are some very specific class dynamics that led to this. So amateurism was early on understood as a mechanism for civilizing those cultures that were not as civilized as the refined cultures of the West. So the Olympic Games has actually been embedded with some kind of political ideologies ever since it got started. And that cuts against the irony of the fact that the Olympics and the International Olympic Committee prefer to think of it as something that is not inherently political. Instead, it's built on a movement that's rooted in what is called Olympism. And the Olympic movement, or Olympism, is based in a number of commitments to sport being an equivalent of universal human rights, and the degree to which sports can facilitate international cooperation. There's a lot of truth to that. There are great opportunities for sports to be able to facilitate those kinds of engagements, but it isn't as simple as that. A few principles that are from the International Olympic Committee Charter, which I think are particularly interesting. One is a simple sort of statement that the idea of Olympism is to spread the Olympic movement. Faster, stronger, higher. We shall do so through virtuous, ethical competition. That's the core foundation. I think most people are supportive of that. The Olympic Games are competitions between athletes, not between countries. Most of us do not experience the Olympics in that way. So we might have individual athletes that we will root for, but for the most part, we rally around the flag and we think about Olympic competitions as, in fact, contests between nations. The number one barometer of measuring Olympic success is the medal count. And the medal count is a nationalistic construct, right? It is defined by nations and their medal count. But the one part, and these are just a few snippets from the charter. My favorite isn't the right word, but the passage from the charter I want to focus on the most is this one. No kind of demonstration or political, religious, or racial propaganda is permitted in Olympic sites, venues, or other areas. This is an explicit reaction. This is not original language in the charter. It's an explicit reaction to the 1968 Olympic protests, which we'll reference here in just a moment. But the IOC and all other members, official members of the Olympic movement will steadfastly insist that the Olympic Games are apolitical. And you may think about all the various ways that that might not be the case in the contemporary landscape, but it's also not the case over the course of time. From the very early Olympic Games, 1904 in St. Louis, 1908 in London, the United States overtly used it as an opportunity to develop a sense of nationhood and distinguish itself as an emerging power against the old world. And this was explicitly part of media coverage in the way that a national team was first conceptualized. In 1956, we had the first boycott of an Olympic Games. The Melbourne Games in Australia were boycotted in part by some nations because of the controversy over the Suez Canal, and by other nations because the Soviet Union had invaded Hungary. But the signature moment of politics in the Olympics probably remains to this day, 1968, when John Carlos and Tommie Smith raised their hands in defiance against continued racial inequality in the United States. And we talked about this in some of the classes I had a chance to visit today. This is a memory that is now largely mythologized and viewed quite positively. At the time, John Carlos and Tommie Smith were vilified. They were kicked out of the Olympic Village. They were not welcomed back home as heroes, and it took them literally decades to repair their lives here in the United States. So I mentioned that that Olympic charter language was an explicit response to this moment. It was designed to prevent any further kinds of political protest because there were fears that in 1972, the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which had given rise to this protest in '68, had some thoughts about renewing the boycott, or there might be some other forms of boycotts. There were a handful of people who were expressing concerns about terrorism, but that was generally speaking not at all on anyone's radar in 1972. So one of the things that I really want to point out as we think about this intersection of Olympics and politics and sports and politics more broadly, and this is a core foundation to all of my work, is that it really sheds light on the myth that sports and politics are kept separate. Many of us do like sports because they are an escape, and there's a degree to which sports are an escape, but they are inherently already political in multiple ways. And so sport is not a distraction from socio-political concerns as much as it is a constitutive site in which these issues can be communicated. And there are a number of ways that happens, one of which is through texts that are connected to what we call public memory. So memory texts become a particularly important way of thinking about this, and that gets me to something like a big memorial at the Olympiapark in Munich. Memory as a term has exploded into the communication discipline's nomenclature. Multiple terms are featured: collective memory, public memory, social memory, folk memory, cultural memory. I will feature the term political, or public memory, I should say, because as a rhetorician, I'm at the core interested in publicity. Meaning, and following scholars Carol Blair, Greg Dickinson, and Brian Ott, the designator public memory reflects rhetoric's emphasis upon concepts of publicity. Thus, it seems preferable in elaborating rhetorical understanding of memory. That is because public situates shared memory where it is often the most salient to collectives in constituted audiences positioned in some kind of relationship to mutuality that implicates their common interests, investments, or destinies with profound political implications. So one of the core contributions to public memory scholarship is that public memory texts are always subject to contest. They are always political, they are always subject to multiple interpretations, they are dynamic, they are fluid, and that for the most part, the choices we make about what to memorialize from the past tell us more about the present than they do about the times from which they have come. So we are often motivated by moments of crisis or shared anxieties in the present that cause us to want to remember some time from the past. Now, often that can be then with a kind of nostalgic lens. That is not the case in the 1972 memorial, and that should be obvious for a number of reasons, but we'll get to that in more detail in a moment here. Public memory in the United States is complicated. Public memory in Germany is really complicated. And one of the things I have discovered in this project, part of what's exciting about it is it's a whole new context for me, but is to try to make some sense of what is a multi-layered and extra complicated concept in another national culture. As Gabriel Rosenfeld, who was an art critic, writes, since its emergence from the rubble of 1945, Germany has been haunted by memory. And it is a peculiar example, particularly because of the need to memorialize by acknowledging its own role as a perpetrator of evil, and how to reconcile that. In the face of this necessary breach in the conventional memorial code, it is little wonder that German national memory remains so torn and convoluted. It is that of a nation tortured by its conflicted desire to build a new and just state on the bedrock memory of its horrendous crimes. So if we think specifically, of course, of the Nazi regime and the legacy of the Holocaust, this collective memory is so overwhelming and so ubiquitous that virtually no aspect of German public life is unaffected. This collective memory crowds out all others in the way Germans are viewed by the world and themselves, how they construct their public choices both at home and abroad, and how they implement their choices. That's a pretty heavy burden to try to make some sense of if we're thinking about how to negotiate the horrors of the past and move forward in the present and in the future. Now, the Germans, how many of you know any German language? Have studied any German? Have some familiarity? Just a handful of you, all right? So we've got some. So you know then, the Germans like long words. They like complicated words. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, yeah. So, genau. So this is a concept that is designed to capture what the German experience of memory is. It is a unique term to the German language. What it captures, then, is that the term memory is not commonly used in any ordinary sense when referring to the nation's strained post-war relationship to its past. Memory, rather, has largely been replaced by one of the most complicated and disputed concepts in the German language, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, usually translated as the process of coming to terms with or mastering the past. The term refers to the Germans' contested and still evolving collective memory of the Third Reich and Second World War. This particular memory is both like and unlike others. The degree to which a relatively brief period of Germany's recent history has dominated the nation's collective memory, disproportionately influenced its contemporary identity, and become an obsessive preoccupation among its people, and it makes it unique. As the painful, ongoing process that transformed past into memory, Vergangenheitsbewältigung defines post-war Germany like few other concepts. And what German culture has done really an eloquent job of is incorporating memory into its everyday experience in ways that we would find unusual in the United States. There are a lot of ways to examine that. I'm going to give you just one representative example that I think best symbolizes that. It's something called the Stolpersteine, which translates essentially to stumbling blocks. The Stolpersteine are installed throughout Germany. There are about 6,000 of them throughout the country. And what they are these gold squares that are built into sidewalks and walkways. And they are designed to be built into places where you literally would step, so that you might stumble, metaphorically at least, over them. Now, these are somewhat controversial because we do not typically think of it being appropriate to step on a symbolic representation of those who have been killed. And that is, in fact, what is memorialized on these stones. This translates to, here lived Erne Kohn, born Weichmann, 1893, deported 1943, murdered in Auschwitz. And so these stones are built into regular, everyday neighborhoods. You would experience them going to the market. You would experience them stepping out of your apartment. And they're a kind of example of the way that German public memory functions to sort of be present all of the time. This does lead to what is referred to as Holocaust fatigue and some concerns that perhaps it's too much, but it is embedded and incorporated into education and daily life in Germany in ways that we would not comprehend in our daily lives in the United States. So it's a fascinating kind of contrast. So I think the Stolpersteine are particularly representative of that. If we think then specifically about the context of sports, because we could spend the entire time thinking just about the ways that we try to come to terms with the Holocaust. Sports do factor into this and into some very specific ways. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, West Germany and East Germany were engaged in a project of trying to normalize relationships to a degree. The West Germans reached a treaty agreement with the Soviets in 1970-71 that facilitated additional international cooperation, and the IOC recognized East Germany as a fully participative nation in 1968. So there was a lot happening in this time of great optimism, and preceding that, in 1965, Munich had been awarded the Games. That is a mere 20 years after the end of World War II. 20 years may not, to me 20 years doesn't sound like it's that long ago, right? It depends on your frame of reference, I realize, and over time 20 years seems like it's less and less, but Munich was the capital of the movement, the home of the Nazi Party, and here a mere 20 years later it's awarded the Olympic Games. So there's a lot of optimism that's wedded to that, and in particular because it stands as such a contrast to what 1936 symbolized. And there is a tremendous amount of video footage, or film footage, thanks to Leni Riefenstahl's Olympia and various other accounts of the 1936 Olympics, but much of it is based in this sort of massive, bureaucratic, militaristic, mechanistic kind of imagery, imposing, fearful, intimidating, right? The fact that, I mean, an image of a crowd of that size in the Olympic Stadium in Berlin in 1936, all with their hands extended toward Hitler, that's a frightening image to this day. And so again, that's much fresher in mind in 1972. We do think of 1936 in some other ways, of course, in the United States, thanks to the legacy of Jesse Owens and others. But in Germany especially, the legacy was much more fraught. So by 1972, there was an opportunity for Germany, West Germany, to reinvent itself. As German Vice Chancellor and Foreign Minister Walter Stiel stated, we must be aware that other nations will be more interested in and critical of us than they have been of other countries that have hosted the Games hitherto. The memory of the Olympics in Berlin in 1936, of our historical past, and not least the awareness of our peculiar political situation will play no insignificant part in this. This therefore offers us the unique opportunity to use the worldwide interest in sport to draw attention to the portrayal of our development and state, and to project to the rest of the world the image of a modern Germany in all its political, economic, social, and cultural facets. So much of what was designed to happen in 1972 was designed to evoke this kind of optimism, this carefree democratic ethos that West Germany sought to cultivate. Central to the modern German image, then, was the nature of how the Olympic Stadium would be built and how it would fold into the landscape. And this is very much a different experience than visiting the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. So I have been to both sites. The Olympic Stadium in Berlin is just outside of a neighborhood. You almost don't even realize you're about to approach the stadium. It is the home of the Hertha Berlin Bundesliga team, so it's still actively in use. It's beautifully maintained. But it has all of these markers and remnants and memories of 1936. Olympiapark, however, is a fully functional city park. It's fantastic. If you're there on a summer day or the weather is nice, it's green, it's lush, it's beautiful, there's lots of water, there are people with their families everywhere, and then there's this big stadium emerging in this really unconventional, beautiful architecture. So you can tell the difference, professional photographer, me. Right? So these are my images from one of my visits to Munich. But you get a sense of the sort of nature of the architecture here. Which is defined by an atmosphere of openness, transparency, and clarity, in part because the architect Günter Benisch embedded the buildings in the landscape so that their visually perceptible magnitude is reduced. The idea was to suppress any sort of remnants or lingering memories of German as a muscular, military kind of state. So much of this then was built on a metaphor of openness that translated quite literally into openness. Security was notoriously lax in the 1972 Games. If you want to understand the modern security state in the context of a mega event like the Olympics, 1972 is where that narrative begins, because the catastrophe was so grave as a consequence of such minimal security. To give you just a very brief overview, because I really do want to focus more on the memory than on the incident itself, which in part is designed to correspond with the intentions of the memorial itself. Let's pay more attention to those who suffered than to those who inflicted the suffering. But I can't take for granted that you all know the details here, so let me give you the basic overview. Early in the morning on September 5th, 1972, 8 terrorists who are affiliated with an organization called Black September, which in effect is loosely a spin-off of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, basically leaped the walls of the Olympic Village because it was so easy to get into, seized 11 members of the Israeli team, coaches and athletes, mostly athletes, in the Olympic Village at 31 Connolly Strasse, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Murdered 2 of the Israelis on site, held the remaining 9 as hostages over the course of the day, which played out on live television. Keep in mind there was absolutely no precedent for this, so TV didn't know what to do other than to simply broadcast what was happening. By the way, while the crisis was unfolding, the games continued elsewhere in the Olympic grounds, and there were literally parts of the Olympic Village where athletes were still lounging in the sun and playing ping pong, and right across the wall there was this hostage crisis going on. This is just unfathomable in today's world, right? Eventually, so the terrorists had decided they requested a flight to Cairo, and so everybody was transported to Fürstenfeldbruck airfield, which is about a half an hour outside of Munich. At the airfield, German police staged what is historically one of the most catastrophically ill-conceived rescue attempts that we've ever seen. Tragic catastrophe, and so it failed miserably. The result was the massacre. So the remaining 9 Israelis were murdered, 5 of the terrorists were killed, and 1 additional death was a German police officer. 3 of the terrorists survived and ultimately were ushered out of the country by Germany itself and returned to Palestine. So there was a considerable wound on top of what had happened because of Germany's effort to basically try to just put everything behind it and close the door on the narrative, and that obviously made things much more painful as a result of that. These are images, this is one of the more famous images of one of the terrorists, I should say, as they're negotiating. And over here is Avery Brundage, who was the head of the IOC, who is one of the more infamous figures in Olympic history for various reasons, one of which is because on the day after this tragedy occurred, he declared in the Olympic Stadium, in the midst of a memorial service to the victims, the games must go on. And many felt that that was an inappropriate response. The games should not have gone on at that time. They did in fact resume and complete as planned. Part of the issue here is that not only was the German effort a catastrophic failure, there was also a reluctance of the German officials to admit their failure, which is an interesting tension in light of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, right? If the state is built around this idea of atoning for its sins of the past and coming to terms with that, then it needs to perform that in the present as well. Over the course of decades, then, 2 of the widows became especially important in the effort to try to get a proper memorial. Anki Spitzer and Ilana Romano, who both for 45 years worked to the point where we finally see a memorial. They met with German officials on multiple times, and German officials refused to accept that they knew anything, refused to admit that they had materials or documents about this. It turns out they had a warehouse full of documents. Eventually, Spitzer was able to retrieve those. Meanwhile, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, refused to acknowledge the tragedy in any formal way. So repeatedly, Spitzer and Romano requested that the IOC hold a moment of silence in honor of the 11 dead. That was especially acute in 2012. That was the 40th anniversary, and in the London Games, they asked the IOC once more. The IOC declined, and then proceeded during the opening ceremonies to have a moment of silence for the terrorist victims of the 7/7 attack in London. Not inappropriate to do that, but especially striking in the absence of not having an acknowledgement of the 40th anniversary. Now that said, there are some previous memorials to what happened. So here is a plaque that is installed just on the wall outside of 31 Königstrasse, the site in the Olympic Village where this happened. By the way, the Olympic Village is a thriving apartment community. It is a really strange experience to walk through it and sort of recognize images that you have seen for years, and I've seen these images for a long, long time, well before I started studying this specifically, and to stand in front of it, and then this plaque is here. The plaque lists the names of the murdered Jewish athletes and coaches. When it was originally erected right after the catastrophe, there were a number of errors with it, not least of which was that instead of the Star of David, where is the Star of David? There is not a Star of David. Oh, well, there's the menorah, but there's not a Star of David. They put a Christian cross, which was a further insult to the Jewish community that the improper symbolic representation was there. The marker over here, these are both my own images. The marker over here is at Fürstenfeldbruck airfield, and it's just outside the entrance of the airfield. You cannot go in without clearance into the airfield. So this is sort of a strange memorial in the sense that it's 30 minutes outside of Munich. The only way you're going to see it is if you work at the airfield or you make a special drive out to go find it, which is what I did. The much more prominent memorial then is called the Klagebalken, which means wailing wall. And this is at the end of a long pedestrian walkway in Olympiapark. So Olympiapark, as I mentioned, is this thriving, beautiful park. On one end is Olympic Stadium. You walk over a highway on this long pedestrian walkway and approach this, and if you go to the right, you would find the Olympic Village on one side, and if you kept walking, you would end up in BMW World, in the BMW Museum. Also recommended sites. They're really cool. So this plaque that's over here says it's in German, but it translates to during the 20th Olympiad in Munich, 11 Israeli athletes and 1 German police officer suffered a violent death during a terrorist attack on September 5th, 1972. Now you'll notice that's all that is there. There's no real context. The names of the Israelis are in Hebrew. There's the name of the 1 German officer in German. But that's it. It's just a concrete beam. My observations of this, and this was installed in 1995, so maybe people just know it's there and they're used to it. But my observations of this site is that virtually no one interacts with it. It's in a place where you don't naturally walk by, so you have to kind of get off the path to go seek it out and read what might be happening there. And so it doesn't really fulfill much of a memory function, certainly in the way that we might expect a memorial to do. So things changed dramatically in 2013 when Thomas Bach, who was a German native, became the president of the IOC and finally began to listen to the years of advocacy that had come from Romano and Spitzer. And so in 2014, an 11-member evaluation committee headed by Zurich-based architect Barbara Holzer announced the winning design by Bruckner and Bruckner Architects out of Germany. As they state, the terrorist attack on September 5th and 6th, 1972 at the 20th Summer Olympic Games, as well as the biographies of the 11 Israeli victims, are at the heart of the exhibition concept and the focus of the entries. In addition, the political dimension of the Olympic Games, the repercussions of the massacre, German-Israeli relations, and terrorism in the 1970s are also explored. So that's language that was used to talk about the proposal for the memorial itself. There are some interesting features of this that I want to focus on. The first is where the memorial is located. So you're looking at an overhead map of part of the Olympic Park. And the red circle indicates the spot where the memorial is located. If you look directly north, you are looking, in essence, at 31 Königstrasse. So that vector that goes just slightly before 12 o'clock to the left, that's taking you so that you can look across the hill and see the Olympic Village and see the exact site. And then if you go south, that's where you're looking toward the Olympic Stadium and the Olympic Village. And if you go straight east, you're looking at the BMW World and BMW Museum. So it's situated right in the middle, which is a particularly important part of the equation for the sightline. This is the hill before they began construction. And so from one side you see the tower, from this side you actually, that little sort of cylindrical kind of thing behind the tree is the BMW facility, the production plant. This is in progress. So this is several months later on a second visit. The signage is still here, giving you the rendering of what it will look like, and on the right, you can begin to see the back wall of what will be constructed. That was the best I could get, because I had to lean over the fence to be able to get the pictures. This is the original rendering, which is interesting because it's a completely cut out design, and that is not the design that ultimately won the day, or at least the way that they ended up executing it. I'll show you that in just a second. But something that's really important here is that the architects themselves talk about the symbolic cut. The cut is the key symbol of the dramatic and momentous event here that is commemorated because it cuts into the earth and creates what the New York Times described as a metaphorical open wound. It is designed to cut into the landscape while still preserving the overall natural environment. And so there's an interesting ability here to harken back to what 1972's original purpose was, which was to integrate the architecture with the landscape, but then to also remove a certain portion of it, to talk about loss, to represent symbolically what kind of wound still remains. As a part of this too then, toward the back, and this is a photograph of the finished construction, so you see it is closed in, and in the back there's a 36-foot wall that is a media wall that depicts a 27-minute loop of media coverage of the event. This is one thing I have yet to be able to see personally, is the media loop. I'm particularly interested in what kinds of coverage they select. One of the things that becomes then especially important, Werner Karg, who was an official with the Bavarian Ministry of Culture, said it was unfortunate that the haunting images of masked terrorists were more prominent in the public consciousness today than the memories and the faces of the victims. And so one of the moves for the memorial is to spotlight and feature the victims, rather than thinking about those images that have become iconic images of terror. So right in the middle of the memorial is a narrow wedge that shows the biographical information of all of the 11 Israelis and the one German police officer. When the memorial opened itself, there was a 25 to 30-minute ceremony that was attended by state officials and by members of the families. The family members removed black curtains that revealed these biographies one at a time. There was some music, and then there were a handful of speeches. And then they moved to a larger, more formal, kind of educational forum in the BMW World Auditorium. They moved there because it was the closest place that had ample security to be able to stage that kind of event. And in BMW World, Anki Spitzer was quoted as saying, "The debt that was owed to our loved ones was finally paid off with this beautiful and moving memorial." A number of the comments then, in a second chapter of the book, the book that I will eventually write, will focus on the memorial itself and its design features. A second chapter will focus on the way state officials have talked about the memorial. But a couple of themes are particularly important from a number of different officials, and I will not list them all in the interest of time, but they focus specifically on the biographical information and how important that is, and on why it is so important for us to memorialize this, all the more so in the wake of renewed efforts and fears of right-wing extremism and terrorism across the world. This is relevant in Germany, especially, where neo-Nazi resurgences are definitely a concern, but it is an issue around the world. One comment in particular that I think warrants some inclusion is from Ludwig Spinella, who was the mayor of Munich at the time. In 1972, he, in retrospect, says, "This is why in Germany one thing is inseparable from our way of life, namely the fact that we assume responsibility for our history and also for the history of the Shoah, including our responsibility for Israel's security as a result of this, and that we fully reject any form of anti-Semitism. To be German means being aware of our history, a history that for young generations brings with it not personal blame, but enduring responsibility." And so what I'm particularly interested in then is, in light of those kinds of comments and the legacy of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, to what extent does the memorial perform a kind of political reconciliation? And I will admit that I am not convinced that reconciliation is the right term here. For those of you who are engaged in rhetorical studies of reconciliation, it's a complicated term, and it tends to focus on relationships between state actors. And in this case, we've got a slightly different kind of dynamic. So I'm not sure yet, but it's a work in progress. Right? So, but in any case, reconciliation is relevant to commemoration. Robert Ivy, who happens to be my former dissertation advisor at Indiana University, writes that commemorative rhetorics need not just be these sort of traditionals to those who have been lost, which he argues sort of dehumanizes because it just turns them into statues and monuments. They might also become strategic rites of humanization and cultural resources for reconciliation. Probably in our field, the leading scholar on reconciliation is Eric Dockstetter, who has written quite a bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And he and his co-author here, Charles Villavicencio, talk about the ability of reconciliation to hold people accountable for past wrongs and to move toward justice in the future. So, does that happen in Germany? And the question is, I think, still an open one. There are some signs for hope and some signs for caution. In terms of some positive signs, the German ethos of Vergangenheitsbewältigung is present in the commemorative words that are echoed by many of the officials who were there for the official opening of the memorial. The location of the memorial physically disrupts the space and invites a kind of reflection and interaction from the people who engage with it. You cannot simply walk by this in the way that you could walk by the Wailing Wall in the same way. The most vocal advocates, Anki Spitzer and Ilana Romano themselves, have been very positive about what has happened here. Romano says, standing on the hill today is a highly moving historical event. And Spitzer says, you see me, it's the first time that I laugh in Munich. So there's a sense that something has been resolved, some healing wound has finally closed. And there are other related aspects of memorialization that are quite promising. There was extensive media coverage of the memorial, certainly in Germany, but also in the United States. The production of a short documentary film called Munich 72 and Beyond, which adds a little bit to the Academy Award-winning documentary One Day in September, which is another recommended artifact for those of you who have seen it. And in 2016, Thomas Bach, the head of the IOC, in a ceremony in the Rio Games in Brazil, had a ceremony where 15 athletes who had died during Olympic Games were memorialized, and he read the names of the 11 Israelis for the first time in an Olympic context. All of that said, there's still reason for some caution about the memorial. In particular, the political explanation that is offered at the memorial site through the program that I have access to emphasizes a fairly abbreviated history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And for reasons that are obvious, given that it's a German memorial to make amends for the sins against Israel, the narrative is not necessarily balanced. Now, there's no way that I'm going to recommend that Black September should be represented sympathetically. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more broadly, I think, warrants a more complicated explanation. There is, for example, no discussion of Gaza, of occupation, of military engagement between Israel and the Arab world. And there is therefore a missed opportunity that if we are to atone for the mistakes of the past and reconcile and come to terms with them, how do we do so if we do not reconcile and account for ongoing conflicts of the present? So there is a concern there. There is also no discussion at any point that I have seen of Israel's state response to the 1972 massacre. And as tragic as the massacre is, Operation Wrath of God brought with it quite a number of consequences in its own right, including the unintentional murder of innocent people who were mistaken for having been affiliated with Black September in 1972. So that is one cause for concern. Another cause for concern is that this parallel that's being made to the contemporary focus on terrorism makes a kind of case for what we would call a cosmopolitan memory. What it does is it universalizes the concerns that we may have by focusing on terror and the obvious shared common ground that we have. And what that does then is, oh, I forgot that I had this particular quotation there. Sorry about that. So this is a reference to actually to something I commented on earlier, that we're talking as much about the present as we are about the past. Barbara Holzer, the lead architect of the jury, talks about how this is so important for us because of the renewed threats of terrorism in the present. And what this does is it kind of universalizes our moral understanding of contemporary conflict, so that rather than having some nuanced understanding of different positions, instead there is a very, you're either with us or against us kind of mentality that potentially emerges here. And so what I would suggest we need as a remedy here is not this kind of cosmopolitan universalizing memory, but instead an agonistic mode of memory. A way of being able to expose the socially constructed nature of collective memory and include the suffering of others, which would rely on a multiplicity of perspectives in order to bring light to the socio-political struggles of the past and reconstruct the historical context in which, ways in which restore the importance of civic and political passions and address issues of individual and collective agency. Finally, I think one of the things that is a limit here is that sport itself is inherently limited. On the one hand, sport models an agonistic rivalry, right? The best rivalries depend on an opponent that you can count on being there. Yes, you want to beat DePaul every year, but you need DePaul to be there in order for it to feel really good, right? So the best agonistic rivalries are rooted in that kind of idea, and so there's value in that. But sport is also especially limited in the Olympic context because of its continued refusal to own its own political symbolism and significance. The Olympics favor universalizing cosmopolitan ideals about how sports will transcend all of these divisions. And there are momentary feelings where I think that's absolutely true, but the reality is that it's only temporary when it does happen, and we cannot allow that to mask the realities of actual enduring conflict. So, to conclude, I think there are wonderful things about the memorial. It is a much needed and long overdue contribution. I think, however, that the universalizing cosmopolitan claims may be overstated, and that we have to recognize that sports capacity may be somewhat limited. And the bottom line is there's a whole lot more work to be done, and I look forward to being able to do that. So hopefully you have some questions or comments, and thank you very much for your time and attention. Left with about 10 minutes, and I'm happy to engage any thoughts or reactions. Yes, sir.
So, thank you for the talk. I have a two-part question. First, in a broad way, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the potentials, the pitfalls of doing rhetorical work abroad, particularly thinking about rhetoric and translation. Based on your pronunciation of the very long German word, I take it you have some fluency in German, and in particular to the artifact that you're working with. I'm curious about the juxtaposition of different languages, German, Hebrew, perhaps English, and sort of how that might play.
Yeah, it's absolutely a part of the study. So first of all, thank you that I have successfully fooled you into thinking that I have fluency. I can read German with some degree of capacity, and I can form basic conversational sentences. I can't hear it well enough to process it, but I have worked through it to some degree. I've had a lot of help with that. I've been lucky in this project to connect with a whole range of people who happen to be interested in this or have some expertise. They've helped me with translations. I had a colleague at Ohio University who is a native of Berlin who told me about the Stolpersteine in the first place. I would never have known about that without that help. And I've just been lucky. To use the stumbling metaphor, I've stumbled into some of this. I've also made a conscious effort to bracket Israeli memory. So I've recognized that German memory is a big enough project, and the location of the memorial in Germany warrants a focus on that context. I can't possibly also take on the context of Israeli memory, although I think that would be viable. In fact, in Tel Aviv, there is a memorial to the 1972 massacre victims there that gets into an entirely other context. So I definitely own that. I recognize that I'm an American. One of the things that I want to do, so the progression of the book should be a sort of chapter that's a backstory on the 72 games in politics and sports. The chapter that is basically this talk, a chapter on the speeches from the ceremony, a chapter on the film, and then a final chapter that does either survey data or interviews with people who interact with the memorial in Munich. And that's part of my effort to learn the language so I can, although Germans know English so much better than we do. So, you know, so it's something that I have to work through, and I'm trying to be very conscious not to apply my assumptions about American culture to German culture, and there's a lot to learn about that.
You mentioned how the weeping wall and the memorial at the airfield are really secluded and out of the way. Would you say that it's somewhat indicative of how Germany kind of struggles with that public memory?
This particular memory, yes. Public memory generally, no. That's why I think it's an interesting contrast, because with the caveat that it's a limited exposure, Germans own their memory of this atrocity in ways that are really striking. My last visit to Munich, I visited Dachau, which is just outside of the city, and is the site of one of, honestly, not one of the more deadly concentration camps. That's a horrible qualifier, I recognize that. But it was the first to be turned into a site where tourists could visit, and so it's well known. And the language of how visitors are brought into the camp is explicit. We will own this so it never happens again, right? There's no hiding from it. So that's why it's really interesting that has been the case, and it reflects a sort of both an embarrassment about German state incompetence in 1972 and IOC complicity with not wanting to do it. The IOC's justification for not doing the moments of silence is they don't want to politicize the games. I kid you not, that's their justification. This is the most political, well, okay, FIFA, but maybe the most political sports organization on the planet, and they want to not politicize the games, but they do so in other ways. So, yeah, I think this is a unique situation.
So to this specific event, I've kind of lost my train of thought.
Can I get another question?
Yeah,
yeah, because there was a hand back here. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to thank you again for this talk and then enjoying dinner with us. The senior rhetoric majors just had to go about this in a similar way. We had to talk about Colin Kaepernick and the anthem protest controversy.
Yeah.
And at one point you said sport is not a distraction from politics, it's a venue to communicate.
Right.
I just want to get your opinion on how the American public reacted to Colin Kaepernick and his anthem protest, and how that fits into maybe this bigger picture, and maybe it's a United States thing specifically, a Germany thing, internationally. Just curious.
Well, let me take the invitation to compare a little bit, in part because that was, if I didn't talk about this tonight, I was going to talk about the NFL anthem protest. So I can give you a 45-minute answer to that, but I know nobody wants that.
We have more time. So.
Yeah, so, yeah, fine. So here's my short answer to that. Colin Kaepernick was accused of politicizing football by protesting during the national anthem. I would say Colin Kaepernick stepped into a space that was already political, already politicized. And so he actualized a political response that was uncomfortable for some people, but the flyovers, the anthems, the military enlistment ceremonies, the reunions with veterans who come back and find their spouses, all of the kinds of military and patriotic ritualizing that takes place in sports, those are already political. They just may be politics that we like or that we support. We think of them as patriotic, not political. It's already political. So I would say the Olympics are already political. When you talk about the process of selecting an Olympic city, when you talk about the process of paying for these stadiums, you talk about the process of who can and cannot compete. This current Olympic Games was ripe with all sorts of these possibilities. To compare to Germany in the specific context, the anthem is fascinating because in Germany, my goodness, you would not have the national anthem as an institutionalized ritual before a sporting event because people would be terrified that it called forth memories of 1936 and the Nazi regime. You would have the anthem at a national event or an international competition. So if you watch the World Cup this summer, Germany will be prominently featured as one of the favorites. They'll play the anthem before the game there, but not during the Bundesliga games. So we do that uniquely in the United States. Canada has really picked it up. So they've kind of borrowed from us. But that's a distinct American ritual, and it emerges because of a specific response to World War II that started in baseball and then was picked up by other sports subsequent to that. Yeah.
So why do you think that Germany may have responded initially to how they did with the whole, the games must go on approach versus maybe taking more action than that? And does their history play into that response at all, or would you think?
So here's the thing, what I think is, Avery Brundage was the IOC president. Brundage was from the United States. He was the former USOC chair, and Brundage was a vicious anti-Semite. Vicious anti-Semite. And in 1936, he had the power to allow the United States to pursue a potential boycott of the 1936 games because of the rising fear of the Hitler regime. And he roadblocked it. He was pals with Hitler, basically. And here he is 36 years later standing in Munich and saying the games must go on. I think there's actually, I just didn't have the time to be able to get into that additional layer. There are so many layers to this particular context. And so Brundage is the one who says the games must go on. The IOC acts independently of the Bavarian state and the larger nation of Germany. Though in the German context, if you think realistically about the 7-year plan to manage the logistics of staging the Olympic Games, of building this amazing set of facilities, of doing all of the things to create the happy, joyful games, and to present a modern face to the world, the last thing you want to do is have it come to an end in that way. So I would have to think there was some support there, but the IOC made the decision to say the games must go on. Okay, so there are lots of hands, so I'm going to go toward the middle, the glasses.
No, I didn't have my...
You're deferring. All right, excellent. To the hat.
Could you relate him saying the games must go on to Franklin Roosevelt's Green Light letter during World War II, where he promotes the playing of baseball throughout the war?
Okay, on the one hand, yes, because we have a tragic moment that is defined by a moment of crisis. How do we handle it? Well, we handle it by continuing our way of life. On the other hand, no, because what Roosevelt was doing was saying that our game will go on in the face of a threat from the outside against us. And Brundage is saying, we're the threat, but the games are still going to go on, right? So the responsibility is in a different place. So there is a parallel that's interesting, but the Green Light letter is much more about sort of Americans rallying together in the face of an attack. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, I think it was Michael and I think Scotty. I see both your hands to get those two, and then we'll
Okay, all right.
Yeah, in your extensive research and travel, I'm curious if you came across any other locations where the 72 massacres just acknowledged, if there are any.
Where, what is it acknowledged?
Where just any other locations or monuments that commemorate the event that happened.
This specific event.
Yeah.
So, I haven't been to Tel Aviv, but there is one there.
Okay.
There is in Cleveland. David Berger, one of the Israelis who was murdered, was born in Cleveland before emigrating to Israel to compete for the team. There is a memorial park for him in Cleveland. There may be some other sort of individualized memorials in that respect. What you will see much more commonly are larger memorials or museums about the Holocaust or the Nazi regime.
So, did you ever have the opportunity to talk about the 72 massacre or the Holocaust with any German youth? And could you compare and contrast their public memory of those events with potentially some older Germans that you might have talked with?
Well, I think, especially now that there is such an obvious public memorial, it would be really interesting to do that. Because presumably that memorial, if it's a rhetorical artifact, and I think it's safe to say it is, it should induce a particular worldview on those who interact with it. So does in fact that symbolic inducement take place? And what is the difference in generations? One thing I can speculate about is that younger generations in Germany are more prone to Holocaust fatigue than older generations are, because they are further and further away. You could make the parallel in the United States to some of the things that we are reminded of in terms of our own guilt on a wide scale, right? There's a reluctance for Americans in 2018 to suggest that we own any moral responsibility for the Native American Holocaust, any moral responsibility for slavery. That happened generations ago. Don't hold me accountable for something my ancestors did. In Germany, there is an enculturation to say that there is a moral responsibility to own that, even if you are not personally responsible for it. It's a fundamental difference. So will that erode over time as generations get further away is a great question to ask. I don't know. I imagine not interacting with children because IRB, Institutional Review Board kind of procedures, and who can I interview and things like that. But it would be a really rich way to think about it.
I'm sure that Dr. Butterworth would be happy to talk to you more during a reception we have out in the hotel lobby. I'd like to thank him again for an excellent talk, and you also for